Office in the School of Arts and Sciences, and our Vice Chancellor for Research and Collaborations, Dr. I'm going to say it, Petro. I know, and I've been practicing all morning. Petroviak.
Excellent.
Excellent. Who will be introducing our esteemed lecturer. So thanks everyone, and I hope you enjoyed the lecture and be engaged in our Q&A. And I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Laura. So I get the pleasant part of introducing our guest of honor, Professor Aradhna Tripati of the University of California at Los Angeles, or UCLA. Now, I lied. I promised Laura that it will take 2 minutes, but it has to take longer because when you realize that someone started full-time enrollment at California State University at Los Angeles at the ripe age of 12, you realize that there will be more than 2 minutes of material. So probably at the equally ripe age of 16 or 17, Aradhna proceeded to the PhD program at the University of California, Santa Cruz, where she obtained her PhD in Earth Sciences. And then her first postdoc, if I'm correct, was at Cambridge. She had a few prestigious fellowships afterwards, and in 2009 she began as an assistant professor at the University of California, Los Angeles, or UCLA, where in 2014 she has received tenure. Now, in terms of the research area, and again, I apologize if I distort anything or misrepresent anything, but her specialty seems to be paleothermochemistry or paleothermometry, which is essentially a climate reconstruction based on a number of techniques, but the favorite method appears to be the clumped isotope approach, which is something which warms the heart of a physical chemist because it's based on subtle differences in the 0-point energy of heavier isotopologues. And as a result, for example, carbon dioxide or carbonates will very slightly sort themselves towards the heavy isotopologues. So for example, carbon 13 will be associated with oxygen 18 because the barrier for breaking these bonds is ever so slightly higher than for the more common carbon 12 and oxygen 16. And based on this technique, Professor Tripati was able to backtrack a number of fascinating data information, including the body temperature, the likely body temperature of dinosaurs, based on the composition of their teeth, and again a number of fascinating information, which is again to a physical chemist and spectroscopist, this is a most fascinating application of the subtle quantum mechanical effect to ancient history of our planet. Aside from the strictly scientific interests, Professor Tripati is I would say, dedicated to equality, diversity, and the notion of community-based or community-engaged science. And this, I think, thread will be very visible, very strong in her presentation today. I would fail if I have not mentioned a number of awards that she had received. The first notable one was perhaps the Career NSF grant, followed 2 years later by the Presidential Early Career Award received from President Obama. Kavli Fellowship, she's also the fellow, she's been elected the fellow of the Geological Society, and a number of other ones where I will keep exceeding the 2-minute limit even more. She's the director and I think the founding director of the Center for Diverse Leadership in Science. Her other affiliations include Institute of the Environment and Sustainability, I think her primary appointment is in the Department of Earth, Planetary and Space Sciences, as well Department of Atmospheric and Oceanic Sciences, and the California Nanosystems Institute. So needless to say, most of us are limited to a 7-day week. I suspect that Professor Tripati's week has at least 9 days, and we are very happy to have you here. Welcome.
Piotr, thank you very much for that very nice introduction. Let me just do a quick check to make sure that you can see the slides okay.
Yes, we see it fine.
Okay, fantastic. So yeah, again, thank you for that really lovely introduction. And I'm excited to be with so many students virtually this year for Research Week at Rutgers. Now, probably for most all of us, this will be our first meeting. So I want to start off with a personal introduction to position myself in the sciences. My name is Aradhna Tripati, and my pronouns are she, they. My parents are immigrants from the Fiji Islands with some ancestry from India due to both having been colonies of Britain. And because of my family history, I've thought about how each of us have really inherited cultural legacies and how this shapes our perspectives on social interactions. And that includes in science, but it also shapes how we view Earth systems, which is one of my areas of specialty. Now, just over a decade ago, I became a faculty member at UCLA, which is a land-grant institution, and I learned it has a complex history with Indigenous peoples as such an institution. So much of my work has been reparative, emphasizing through the research and education I do, the empowerment of Indigenous peoples and other BIPOC peoples, and also supporting relationship building with non-BIPOC peoples. And by BIPOC, I mean Black, Indigenous, and people of color. How I know this type of work is occurring at many higher education institutions and across society, and that there have been calls for change, continued calls for transformative change in all of these spaces. And I know that's happening here at Rutgers as well. And that, some of these calls for action have been in response to ongoing anti-Black and anti-BIPOC violence, including with the killings of Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, Daunte Wright, and Adam Toledo, as well as many others. And so I really want to acknowledge the time that we are in and the discussions that we're having, and some of my talk today will touch on these issues. I also want to do a land acknowledgement. UCLA is on the lands of the Tongva people who have been impacted by 3 waves of colonialism. And also that I'm a guest at Rutgers University, which is located on the ancestral lands of the still living, still sovereign Munsee Lenape peoples, community, and nation. The lands and waterways of both regions have been stewarded by Indigenous peoples for generations. Now, the work that I've been doing that I'll talk about today will actually touch on stewardship. And that work is principally done at my current institution. But I also want to acknowledge that as a researcher at Caltech and at the University of Cambridge, there have been a whole series of kind of contexts and peoples that we've interacted with, including some of the folks who've contributed to this talk today. So I show a list of group members, past and present, as well as a number of collaborators, including geoscientists, my area of specialty, but also social scientists, tribal partners, and community leaders. So the work that I'll show really represents the application of an inclusive science framework that I'll talk about towards the end of today's talk. And the taste that my goal today is to really give you a taste of the different areas that we've been able to work on that relate to this field of clumped isotope geochemistry that I'll tell you more about, climate science, biogeochemistry, and stewardship. So I want to also highlight that my motivation comes from events like these. This shows the fire, the upper left, this shows a photograph from the aftermath of the recent fires in Paradise, California. The upper right shows an image from Hurricane Katrina. And then the lower right shows an image from Hurricane Sandy. Now, probably about 2 years ago, I heard a story on NPR on the radio about the experiences of young children after catastrophic events like these. And this was specifically in the context of the fires in California. And they talked about how with these events, some families lost everything. And in some cases, there were children that had lost a parent and didn't have the words when they were in school. These are school-age kids. They didn't have the words to really process fully what they were experiencing. And I was so moved when I heard that story and thought about the scars that would leave on individuals and families and communities, things that could define their entire lives. And I'm sure we can all empathize with that because we've all faced loss at some point or will. I also appreciated that these types of losses, when it comes to communities that have been disenfranchised for generations, be they communities of color in this country, communities where there are families living in poverty, we might then in those cases, the scars may lead to lifelong and in some cases, multi-generational effects. In fact, there's a social scientist, Mike Davis, who wrote in a book about how 3 El Niños at the end of the 19th century had an impact on atmospheric processes that transport water, such that in the course of about 2 decades, these 3 severe El Niños led to droughts and famines in places like China, Brazil, India, the Horn of Africa. And the geopolitical response at that time, because of colonialism, led to 20 to 60 million people losing their lives. And that was really due to the geopolitical response to those droughts and famines. And he described how this really shaped the future outcomes for entire countries of people. Now, what I'm struck by is that when I read the news, in any given year, there may be similar numbers of tens of millions of people at risk in any given country due to issues like drought and famine. And I think about what is the current geopolitical response, what has happened that has impacted water systems, food systems, and impacted, say, resilience that had existed previously due to ongoing colonialism that's been occurring. And I really want to highlight that when we look at data sets, the types of data sets that we look at with respect to the chemistry of Earth materials or other types of data sets, what we see is that there's evidence for climate change really not just impacting environments and the people in them, but that can have a destabilizing influence on entire societies. This shows the work of Larry Edwards' group at the University of Minnesota. It shows data from the measurements of oxygen 18 to oxygen 16 from cave deposits at a location in China over the past 2,000 years. And what was interesting is that this indicator tells us something about the strength of the summer monsoon, given the specifics of the environment and materials that they're looking at. And what they were able to show is that the decline of 3 major dynasties each coincided with periods of weakening monsoon, and that when the monsoon strengthened, prosperous dynasties arose. Now, these types of signals showing that there are relationships between environments, individual people, communities, and entire societies come up time and time again, be it in oral histories, chemical records, or written records. And this is something we see when we look at the last decade, the last 200 years, or the last 2,000 years. What I also find remarkable as a climate scientist is that these types of records that I've been describing are ones that are from intervals of time when the Earth has had relatively stable climatic conditions. The changes that we've had in temperature and rainfall that are amplifying social inequities and leading to major disruption, well, those are relatively small compared to what we've been seeing as of recently and what we'll see over the course of the next several decades of our lives. And so today I'm going to describe 4 main areas of my research program that are relevant to acting on the climate crisis. One relates to studying the chemistry of Earth materials, and I'll talk about how my work has taken us to explore the physical geochemistry of multiple what are termed clumped isotope systems in dissolved inorganic carbon species and carbonates. And so a clump species simply refers to a molecule that has multiple heavy isotopes in it. So those heavy isotopes are paired or clumped together. And I'll talk about one clumped system that's indicated by delta 47 notation, which I'll define later, and also some work that we've been doing on delta 48. So making these paired clumped isotope measurements of both mass 47 and 48 signatures. And my lab is one of only 2 labs in the world that's making those paired measurements with high precision. Our work has also led to the foundations for using these paired measurements in concert with models to study things like peridotites, a type of rock type where geological carbon sequestration is actually occurring. But we can also study biological systems that help to serve to sequester carbon. My lab is also emphasizing the use of mass 47, it's one particular clump species, as a tool for studying Earth's climate evolution. And I'll talk about examples of how we're doing this in the oceans and on land to test the robustness of climate model, their skill at predicting different climate states. Finally, I'll move on to talking about other work that we're doing with partners outside of the higher education space to bring together different knowledge systems. For example, with tribal partners to support equitable exchange of both Western STEM knowledge and Indigenous knowledge systems, and also to work together on knowledge co-production in support of stewardship. And this type of work has implications that range from thinking about fire management to water resilience to supporting terrestrial and marine ecosystem storage. Now, with all of the work we do, we recognize that science really benefits from the engagement of and interaction with people that have different expertise, including different cultural backgrounds, as well as different scientific trainings. That fundamentally people are at the heart of all the work we do. So I developed a model of a Center for Broadening Participation with a very unique structure, and I'll talk about that. I'll highlight the work we're doing institutionally and at a national level to put educational theory into practice. All right, so the first part of the talk, I'm going to describe some exciting areas that relate to the systematics of clumped isotopes, including discoveries that we've made at the frontiers of clumped isotopes with novel instrumentation, as well as pretty ambitious and integrative studies that have revealed new isotope effects and that let us probe carbon transformation in a range of different environments. And I also want to highlight that this work is mainly led by the folks who are shown on this slide. This shows some of the graduate students and postdocs and researchers who've contributed to this work. I also want to highlight that our lab is very much undergraduate powered. And so many of the names that I showed on the first slide were of some of those undergraduates. All right, so the field of stable isotope geochemistry has been around for about 90 years. It's historically looked at molecules that are very abundant, that have the really abundant isotopes in them, like what I show labeled number 1 for carbon dioxide, which has a carbon 12 and 2 oxygen 16s in it, which are the most abundant of each of those isotopes, each of those atoms. And I also want to highlight that that stable isotope geochemistry has also looked at the abundance of singly substituted isotopologues, or isotopic species. So for example, molecules that have a single 13 carbon in them or a single 18 oxygen in them. Now, people have used this as a tracer of processes that impact the water cycle, biological carbon formation, or geological materials formation, as well as synthetic materials. But John Eiler at Caltech broke things open for a whole new era in stable isotope geochemistry with the field of clumped isotope geochemistry that looks at multiple rare isotope substitutions in molecules, or multiply substituted isotopologues or clumps. So, his lab and others, folks are looking at a range of different materials from not just carbon dioxide, but N2O, methane, even organic molecules. And they're even starting to explore the use of making these measurements as a tool for drug discovery. My lab, we principally have focused on using this as a tracer for Earth's climate system. And so that's where we've really dove in deep in and established a unique space for ourselves within science. When the first papers were published, I was a research fellow with a group at the University of Cambridge, and I saw that it had the potential to answer really many of the questions that I was fascinated by in paleoclimate or its climate history. And so I held a visiting fellowship in John's lab when the first papers were published. Now, as Piotr had mentioned, One of the really exciting aspects of this tracer is that it's deeply rooted in physical chemistry. It's based on thermodynamic equilibria, based on some of the same principles that govern the much more widely used carbonate water oxygen isotope geothermometer. Now, Harold Urey was a physical chemist who did some landmark calculations in the 1940s, looking at partition functions for different isotopic species, including clumpy variants of molecular hydrogen. But it actually took several decades for this work to be revisited and for some of the first measurements to be made. And so this was really done about 17 years ago by John Euler's group. And that's really what opened the door for a whole new area of geochemistry, because they had done both theory as well as measurements. Now, the basis for using this as a tool for geothermometry, for looking at climate change, for example, or the temperature formation of different materials, is the fact that the substitution of a heavy isotope for a light isotope in a bond reduces the vibrational frequency of that bond and therefore impacts its zero point energy. So in the competition for the heavy isotope, the substance with a larger zero point energy is more stabilized by that heavy isotopic substitution. And that's really critical. So in the case of isotope exchange reactions, such as what I show here for calcium carbonate, these zero point energy differences between isotopologues provide a thermodynamic driving force, which promote the stability of the clump species at low temperatures. But what's also interesting is that for these clumped species, for reactions such as this one for calcium carbonate, the temperature sensitivity is incredibly subtle. You can see that because the equilibrium constant for this reaction that's shown in this graph varies in the 4th decimal place over a temperature range of well over 500 degrees C. So that is a really subtle temperature sensitivity. That means that in order to apply this thermometer, particularly if we want to address questions over the temperature range of, say, 0 and 30 degrees C, so Earth's surface temperatures, we really have to be able to measure the abundance of this species with a very high degree of precision. We also have to know that if we're measuring in any compound, that compound formed an equilibrium and that its chemistry wasn't altered. Now, in the case of the clumpy species of calcium carbonate, the CO3 group, the carbonate ion group, has a mass of 63 AMU, and we can report the abundance of this clumpy molecular species using delta notation, comparing the ratio of the mass 63 isotopolog to the most abundant isotopolog with a mass of 60. And so we report the parts per thousand excess in our sample relative to what would be there if there was a stochastic distribution of isotopes amongst all possible isotopologs. Now, we make high precision measurements on the gases that are produced after digesting minerals, just because it's really hard to measure using spectroscopic techniques the isotope ratios of solids with a high degree of confidence, whereas we have well-developed analytical techniques that go back about 70 years for mass spectrometry and a few decades for laser spectroscopy that allow us to do this in gases. So what we do in the case of this mass 63 isotopolog is after we digest it in phosphoric acid, what we have is CO2 that has a 13C 16O 18O present in it. And so it has a mass of 47 AMUs. So we use delta 47 notation analogous to our delta 63 notation. Now, what's also interesting is that this is not the delta 63 or delta 47 isotopologs are not the only multiply substituted ones that we can look at. There are some that are even more rare that we can explore. But because these are more rare, they're even harder to measure. So typically they're really only used to screen for contaminants. But I developed a conceptual framework and a theoretical framework for utilizing paired measurements for probing kinetic effects. And more recently, we've been able to make some of the first measurements. So I'll also show data for how we use the mass 48 measurement to probe kinetic effects as well. And just want to highlight that this is also done, reported with similar notation. Now, in terms of actually how we calculate these isotope ratios, I want to highlight that there are other mass 47 isotopologs in our sample and also other mass 48 isotopologs in our sample. So we actually have to write out their abundance and do mass-dependent corrections for the abundance of these other isotopic species. So I show at the bottom how we write this out using R notation, where R simply refers to the ratio of the heavy to light isotopes. So for example, R13 would be the ratio of 13C to 12C, or R47 would be the ratio of 47 to 44 carbon dioxide. All right, so in today's talk, there's a lot that I won't have time to highlight, but I do want to mention that, in order to be able to use this as a tool for climate change, we've had to explore fundamental controls on carbonate clumped isotope fractionations in geological systems. And that includes method development. It includes exploring other analytical frontiers, to doing inorganic precipitation experiments, theoretical calculations using density functional theory, as well as transition state theory, and then developing lab-based and field-based calibrations for different types of materials, and then studying post-formation alteration that can occur. And so the work of my own group is about over 40 papers that straddles all of this type of, all of these different areas of clumped isotope geochemistry. Now, also, in order to really develop a very robust tool, one needs to make sure that one laboratory, when they measure something, they get similar results to other laboratories. And so initially there was just the Caltech group that came online, and then a few others that trained in that group, like myself. But then as more and more groups came online, and they all brought their own sets of perspectives and innovations to how we should make these measurements, we started to discover that, in fact, there were different approaches that labs were using for standardization, for isotope ratio calculations, different types of instruments in terms of how they were engineered. And people also started exploring samples of different sizes, as well as a number of different types of archives, and having different hypotheses for kinetic effects. And so the field has really developed substantially since when the first measurements were reported in 2004. What I show on the left in the x-axis is the average value from a recent interlab calibration study of about 24 different labs around the world that are making this measurement. And then on the y-axis is what's shown is for this group of standards, each white circle are the values reported by an individual lab. The fields that are in color are from my own lab, and then the fields that are in red are our lab average. And so what this just shows is we run a tight ship, and our data certainly are accurate. Now, we also did a survey of a number of different types of materials. My own work at Caltech in 2010 really was the most in-depth study of natural materials at that time, and really surveyed oceanic materials. Oceans cover 70% of the Earth's surface, and the oceans kind of serve as a bathtub that accumulate basically products of weathering, biological products. And so they're incredibly important for our understanding of Earth's climate history. Well, so I really did some of the foundational work to establish that ocean sediments could be used as a tracer of Earth's past climate history using this technique. Well, since then, there's been a number of other measurements made, and I just want to show you really quickly that when we grow calcites in the lab, be it my lab or other labs, we see a strong temperature dependence, and that's what's shown in the upper left. That confirms the robustness of this technique. We can go and collect materials from freshwater settings on land, and this shows mainly work for my group, be it land snails, marine snails, freshwater snails, freshwater bivalves, microbial precipitates, and we get very similar systematics. We do see some hints that maybe at low temperatures, where the kinetics of different reactions are much slower, there may actually be different fractionations. And we also see when we culture different types of organisms in the lab, most of them adhere to kind of where we thought they should be given culture conditions, but there are some organisms that form biominerals that are significantly offset. Now, my group has been really actively working to understand why we actually have these differences and why we actually have equilibrium attained in some cases. So in a series of papers we published over the last 7 years, I laid out a conceptual and theoretical framework for testing for equilibrium using these multiple measurements. Using density functional theory, a postdoc in my group showed that the main clumpy species we're exploring, mass 47, actually shows that the dissolved inorganic carbon species, carbonate ion and bicarbonate ion, have different temperature-dependent equilibria, and they differ from carbonate minerals like calcite and aragonite shown here. So one possibility then is that because the composition of a composite dissolved inorganic carbon pool varies with pH and with temperature, then for anything that records solution equilibria, you'd actually not have it just reflect a mineral equilibrium, but in fact, it could reflect a temperature-dependent solution equilibrium that would also be pH-dependent, as shown here. Now, we set out to test postdoc Pam's theoretical predictions using a set of experiments at 25 degrees C, and that's what's shown here. What this shows is actually that the clumpiness of the composite dissolved inorganic carbon pool looks like basically the abundance of carbonate ion in solution. So it shows that these effects can be, in fact, recorded, and that you can get variation with solution pH. What this means is that if we look at, say, a multi-isotope space like oxygen isotopes and clumped isotopes for mass 47, then changes in temperature would influence this, but also changes in pH could be important, or changes in the kinetics of other processes could also drive isotope fractionations, or basically one isotope being incorporated differently from another. Now, more recent work has suggested that if we look at calcite and dolomite, this is calcium carbonate, and this is calcium magnesium carbonate with a kind of one-to-one stoichiometry for calcium to magnesium in the carbonate mineral. Well, those two have really similar compositions to each other as a function of temperature. But what's also interesting is that if we look at them if we look at things like the non-solid solution end members for those minerals, what we see is that that cation substitutions can actually induce lattice distortions that would contribute to these minerals having different equilibrium isotope compositions. And we also showed that we might be able to tease these apart or detect these using paired 47 and 48 measurements. So this is really one of our theoretical foundations, suggesting that for multi-clump systems, be it 47 and 48, 47 and oxygen isotopes, or 63 and 64, in all cases, we'll have a temperature-dependent equilibrium, but then the kinetics could be discerned of specific processes by whether samples follow a particular trajectory. Now, it took us about 5 years, but we finally succeeded in making some measurements. Graduate student Jamie Lucarelli did this. And so this line here shows the temperature-dependent equilibrium for 47 and 48, but then a suite of different materials that conform to this equilibrium. And what's also quite exciting is that she did a set of experiments and found that the trajectory for kinetics for this particular equilibrium, this particular disequilibrium process, is different than the temperature-dependent equilibrium. So this shows that, in fact, we may be able to fingerprint different reactions and their kinetics using this paired isotopic space. So let's actually now think about how we can use this knowledge of kinetic effects to start to explore processes in the natural world. And in this case, I'm going to show you an example of processes that are relevant to carbon sequestration. This is very recent data from graduate student Zishan Parvez that I'll be showing. And so I just wanted to highlight, it's just like the last couple of weeks of his results. So now carbon sequestration has come to the fore because we're at the point now where greenhouse gas emissions need to be reduced dramatically. But we also need to couple this with active carbon dioxide removal if we want to prevent global average temperatures from exceeding 2 degrees centigrade this century. And just to put that in a context, the amount of warming in the past century was about 0.6 degrees centigrade. Now, how do we do this? Well, that can be done through a number of ways. It can be done through conservation and stewardship, because it turns out that many different land-based and marine ecosystems are extremely efficient at sequestering carbon, but human modifications of the environment have negatively impacted the ability for ecological carbon storage to function well. We can do things like regenerative agriculture, agricultural practices that actually support carbon drawdown and not carbon emissions. We can look at geobiologic engineering or direct air capture using synthetic materials. But other areas also involve looking at geological processes that occur, such as geologic weathering through some of the chemical reactions I show here in the upper left, that are also extremely effective at carbon sequestration. And I just want to highlight that the solution is not going to be any one of these things, but it's actually going to be doing probably most of these things. With that, how do we actually study then the efficacy of these techniques? Well, one of the things about carbon mineralization and sequestration using these types of minerals that occur in rock types termed peridotites, where there's abundant calcium and magnesium needed for reaction. In those particular cases, what we see is that there's relatively minimal infrastructure needed to support these types of activities. And in nature, we already have waters that are relatively CO2 enriched that come to the surface and then penetrate through surface channels and through fractures into these rock bodies. When that happens, they end up hydrating these minerals and force these chemical reactions that are collectively termed serpentinization reactions. And so when that happens, then the byproducts of these reactions, including calcium carbonate and other carbonate minerals, they end up getting then precipitated in these fractures and getting sequestered within the rock body. Now, also when that happens, the precipitation of those carbonate minerals is associated with a sharp increase in pH. And that then leads to these peridotite bodies actually having these second type of waters that occur that are CO2 depleted and calcium and hydroxyl enriched. These can often bubble into the surface in surface springs. And sometimes you can actually have then these waters, these type 2 waters, then actually interacting with type 1 waters at the surface as well. And you can have precipitation, further precipitation occurring of carbonate minerals. So our lab began looking at paired 47 and 48 measurements in different types of carbonates to see if we could test the theory and advance a framework that could be used more broadly to test models of kinetic isotope effects. And we've been collaborating with researchers to look at a setting in Northern California termed Cedars, which is a natural lab to examine these fundamental fractionations. And some of our results are shown here, where these different colored triangles and circles, these different triangles refer to the data for different samples in a paired 47-48 space. And the circles reflect theoretical calculations for the isotope trajectory given equilibrium times. Now, if we take a look at this, we can also see that most of the data fall along this type of array, going in this direction, whereas the temperature-dependent equilibrium goes in the opposing direction. What we also see is that the data conforms to a trajectory that's consistent with high pH waters, those type 2 waters, being shuttled through the surface through springs in the Cedars groundwater system and expressing kinetic effects due to a favored hydroxylation pathway for dissolved carbon dioxide. In fact, the majority of mineral precipitation is occurring within the first hour based on our modeling. And a return to equilibrium is only occurring at a couple of the sites where carbonate precipitation from waters appears to have occurred some 500 to 1,000 hours after of systems evolution time. So we're excited about this because it means we can effectively track the transformation of dissolved CO2 into carbonates at surface springs where these types of waters occur, where they're mixing, and we can start to better understand CO2 dynamics and interactions with water at different potential sequestration sites that are of interest more broadly. Now, another example of how we can trace reaction pathways using these tracers I show here. There's a growing body of work that suggests that many minerals, be they biominerals or inorganic minerals, form from amorphous precursors. And several years ago, I hypothesized that some of these amorphous precursors, ACC or amorphous calcium carbonate, and ACMC or amorphous calcium magnesium carbonate, that they should be distinct from mineral transformation products. And I also hypothesize that they may be less ordered than the minerals that eventually form from them. And it turns out our first observations from the past year suggest that this turns out to be true. My lab observations are shown in the bright colors in the upper left plot. And what you can see is that for mass 47, we've used 3 different types of synthesis methods for these amorphous carbonates. And in all cases, they actually are much less ordered than the predictions of equilibrium are, which are around 0.7 to 0.72 per mil. What's also interesting is that if we give our samples time to transform, in the case of this green sample, it eventually comes to a value like this. So it does eventually become more ordered. Now, what's also interesting is that one of our collaborators who used shared samples with us, they also sent samples to another lab, and they published a paper where they let it transform, and they didn't see any such measurement. But the fact that we've been able to reproduce this again and again shows that our results are robust, and that actually what probably happened is what they thought was amorphous material probably transformed as they were handling it. We were able to dive more deeply into this with close to 100 measurements of different types of amorphous carbonates. And what we were able to show is that over time, if we structurally characterize them, you can actually see this kind of transition to more ordered values occurring in the mass 47 space. But what's also super interesting is that in the mass 48 space, those values are actually becoming less ordered. And so that to us was really fascinating. What we also see, though, is that the values that they're approaching are close to the equilibrium values. So that suggests that these were actually the ones that were out of equilibrium, but for a process that we're starting to try to identify using modeling. Now, some of the pattern that we're seeing in mass 47, at least, is consistent with a dissolution reprecipitation mechanism for governing actually these mineral equilibrium values, the ones that are eventually achieved. So I've shown you there now a couple of examples of how we can probe the kinetics of processes and identify when there are kinetic effects using clumped isotopes. I next want to highlight some of the equilibrium methods, because those are actually particularly exciting for thinking about Earth's climate. One of the things we had to do for this work is really develop a statistically robust framework for improving accuracy and uncertainty estimations. And so for this work, we've taken historic data, all corrected the same way from the first measurements at Caltech to data from other labs. And about half the data points are actually from my own lab, where we've really been diving deep into carbonate measurements. And so this means now we have over 600 data points. It's the largest calibration data set that exists that we're able to analyze within a Bayesian framework. And our goal is to improve the accuracy of our calibrations as well as uncertainty estimates of our predictions. We're exploring a linear regression model, a linear mixed model where we vary the slope and intercept per material, as well as developing a phylogenetic linear mixed model. So to look at different taxonomic scales. Now, these types of statistical methods are very data intensive. So the larger the sample size, the better the performance. And what's really exciting is that we've been able to show that we can get 2 sigma errors on the order of 0.5 to 1 degree C at Earth surface temperatures if we use our linear mixed model and have very high precision, and that our uncertainties are largely dominated by measurement uncertainties as well as population statistics. I just want to give you a sense of how powerful these Bayesian methods are compared to some of the regression models we might be more used to exploring. And so Christian Roman Palacios was a graduate student at the University of Arizona. He actually collaborated with me as an undergrad when he was in Columbia. And then he emigrated to the US for his graduate work, and we continued actually trying to push our study forward further. And now he's a postdoc, and we now have really large data sets. So we're kind of moving forward with trying to publish this work with him. What he's shown here is what happens if you use errors where, for example, regression models where, for example, you weight the errors in X and Y, like a York regression or a Deming regression. And then what's shown is the confidence intervals for some of these in beige. And what happens if you have low measurement errors, intermediate errors, or even higher errors? This here is a typo. And then also what happens if we use some of these Bayesian models? And the main thing I want you to note, there's actually 2 things I want you to note. One is that when you have intermediate or high errors, actually then the Bayesian models have significantly lower uncertainty compared to these other error and variable models. The second thing I want you to note is that the accuracy of the slope and intercept is considerably different. So what you can see here really is the difference between the true and then modeled value by these black and yellow lines here. And so you can see there's a mismatch between them, whereas the Bayesian models get much closer to the true value in this case. And so it just goes to show that this kind of additional statistical rigor actually gives us more accurate results as well as more precise results. So for the next part of my talk, I want to highlight some of the work we've been doing to study Earth's climate history. This is really what motivated me to get into physical geochemistry in the first place, and these different areas of statistics. I also want to highlight that the work we're doing, it's both in the marine and terrestrial realm. It is motivated by these questions here, which were questions that I was fascinated with as a graduate student. But now some, 25, 30 years later, we actually have the tools and the foundation to be able to do this work in really kind of exciting ways. So, I've gone back to some of the questions I've focused on throughout my career, but brought these kind of exciting tracers in. And it's been such a delight to see where a number of undergraduates like Lyman Pinto and Alexa Terrazas, where they've been taking this work, as well as different graduate students and postdocs who are shown here. So one of the main targets that we've had has been to look at the last glacial maximum, or LGM, which is about 20,000 years ago, because a lot of climate models are run for this interval of time. And we know the forcing of climate change by carbon dioxide, methane, and a few other greenhouse gases through the ice core record of CO2 that's shown here. We also have a pretty good idea about what the extent of ice sheets, which also influence climate, what that was at the last glacial maximum. And we have a really great handle from calculations done by astrophysicists as to what the incoming solar radiation would have been from the sun. Now, my first work really set out to look at these two regions in the West Pacific and then the Caribbean, where these are open ocean areas that have some of the warmest ocean temperatures on the planet. And that means that as they warm, we see dramatic changes in atmospheric water vapor, which is a really potent greenhouse gas. And this is a way then that changes in climate we can see what are termed positive feedbacks in a climate change occur that then can further amplify climate change. Turns out there's been a major debate over just how much the temperature of this region has changed through time. And what's shown here is the change in temperatures in the West Pacific from a range of different proxy methods. And so you can see that those changes in temperature range from about just under a degree centigrade to as much as 6 degrees centigrade. And that climate models show a range anywhere from about half a degree centigrade to about 4 degrees centigrade. So we looked at clumped isotopes at a number of different sites for the West Pacific and developed a record going back about 30,000 years. We statistically pulled data together using a similar approach to a compilation study that looked at these other different approaches. And we showed that there was evidence for about a 4-degree C change in temperature. So larger than a lot of recent studies have shown, but more similar to some of these non-thermodynamically based methods. We also were able to use this to then evaluate climate models and assess which models were most robust and explore some of the reasons why different models may have been underestimating Earth's climate sensitivity. It may be because they're not getting the frequency of El Nino right, or that they may not be getting some of the feedbacks to be as sensitive as they should be. We also know that some of these models don't include dust, and dust has the potential to be a major feedback in the climate. Now, more recently, Alexandra Villa, who's a graduate student at the University of Wisconsin and was an undergraduate in my group, she set out to look at data from the Caribbean. And what's shown here is in blue, a method that is not thermodynamically based, and then in gray, a more recent recalculation of these data using more recent insights as to what the controls are in this other methodology on magnesium calcium. And in red, what you see are Alex Villa's measurements. And you can see that they corroborate, in fact, this reinterpretation of the magnesium calcium record. And Alex has about another 25 samples that are prepared and is waiting for instrument time in our lab to be able to run them. All right, so these data are then suggesting that the amplitude of temperature change in the tropics, particularly in the Western tropics, may be particularly large. What are the implications of this? Well, it turns out that changes in temperature at sea level actually have quite dramatic effects on a number of factors. And that if you start off with some initial temperature at sea level, say, values that we have today are around 29, 30 degrees C in the warm pool, and you start off with some humidity, you can calculate from first principles what the temperature trajectory would be of a parcel of air as it rises and it starts to cool adiabatically. So just as it rises, there's this reduction in pressure, which then means that you have this air mass then expand over a larger volume. And so then the temperature of that parcel of air then is reduced. And at a certain point, temperatures get cool enough that you can no longer just use PV equals nRT to calculate its temperatures. You also have to factor in that it's cool enough for condensation to occur. And so this is really that level at which we see the base of the clouds up in the sky. And so that's where condensation is occurring. And so then you have a latent heat of condensation being released. And so then the temperature trajectory is PV equals nRT plus then this latent heat being released. So it follows what's termed a wet adiabat, and it cools a little more subtly until at some point it's cold enough that we actually reach the 0 degree C isotherm, that all moisture actually will then freeze out. So this temperature trajectory is termed the adiabat, with both a dry adiabat and a moist adiabat, and it's what we teach about in our thermodynamics classes. But what's fascinating is that when we actually looked at the data that we had from clumped isotopes for modern and recent samples, and we combined it with data from the 20th century about the lowermost extent of glaciers in the tropics, which tell us about then the 0 degree isotherm, that freezing line, we found that those data couldn't be explained by a theoretical adiabat. And so then that led students working with a colleague and I to take a closer look at data from balloons, where they stick quality control data loggers and then monitor temperatures. And what we found was that actually the modern temperature profiles don't follow an adiabat at all for 3 different sites that vary from being islands to being, Darwin, Australia, so, continental sites. So that was really interesting because it showed us that a model we were teaching about, when we actually looked at it rigorously with data, is a good theoretical model, but doesn't tell us the whole story. We then looked at our data for the last ice age, and we also found that an adiabat couldn't explain it, and that if we assumed that some of the other temperature reconstructions for the last ice age were correct, the ones that only showed 2 degrees C, that those would give us even more inaccurate results if we compared them to glacial deposits that told us about the height of the freezing line. So it looked like this was not a great model. But as we started to dive more deeply into theoretical literature, we saw that some dynamicists were arguing that, in fact, we had to take into account the turbulent mixing in of air as a parcel of air rises. That's not really considered with this model of the adiabat. So what the adiabat's actually doing when it looks at the temperature trajectory of a parcel of air, it's looking at something like that parcel of air is encased in a balloon. So it's not mixing with its environment. Whereas what you see is, in fact, mixing is occurring. Of course, it's not encased in a balloon. And so it's mixing in with air of the different buoyancy. And so we can more accurately predict then temperatures if we use this entraining model, both for the modern and also for the last ice age. In fact, our clump data and the entraining model were the only factors that could really fully explain all the observations. Now, we're looking at a number of different environments with our climate reconstructions, from past massive carbon emissions and looking at Earth's climate response, to looking at deep ocean temperatures through time, so even looking at time intervals in Earth history where we think the Earth had glaciers extending that were extensive in the tropics, and that the oceans might have even had sea ice. And so looking at times close to 1 billion years ago in Earth's history. And so this just gives you a sense of what the potential is for this technique in the marine realm. Now on land, what we see is, when we look at deposits across the US, what we see is that the Western US, in fact, today, which is very arid, had extensive lake systems, the size of lake system of some of the Great Lakes during the last ice age, but also different during past warm intervals and high CO2 intervals in Earth history, like the mid-Pliocene and the early Eocene. So we've started looking at some of these sites that are shown in yellow to explore with clumped isotopes what the temperature changes were and what different processes were that transport water. And a lot of this work has been led by undergraduates. So what's shown here in the circles are actually our temperature data from clumped isotopes for different sites from Mexico and across the US, compared to 2 different climate model simulations. And then this number in the lower left shows those data for the last ice age compared to climate model skills. So this is a skilled model, one that does a good job of reproducing the data, and an unskilled model. And so this lets us actually pick apart then which models we should have more confidence in than others using this thermodynamically based tool. We also realized that with lake water temperatures, we could then go even further and calculate air temperatures and evaporation rates. And then within a framework where we're drawing on civil engineering set of modeling constraints, we can then even calculate past rainfall rates. And so what's shown here are evaporation estimates compared to skilled and unskilled models, and then also rainfall estimates compared to skilled and unskilled models that are really allowing us to start to tease apart dynamically why certain models are doing a better job than others. Is it because of how they represent changes in the monsoon or how they represent changes in winter storminess? And so we're able to begin to parse this out. Now, as part of for the next part of the talk, I want to highlight work we're doing to support co-developed research and education projects with tribal authorities and community-based organizations that build capacity in higher education with our own cultural awareness and ability to ethically collaborate, whilst simultaneously also building capacity in communities that have been and are most impacted by climate injustice and other forms of injustice. Some of our work includes laying foundations for developing knowledge bases in earth and marine science and chemistry and hydrology that bring together Western STEM and Indigenous knowledge to some of these other areas that are shown here. And I want to highlight some of the students and youth and young adults that are really on the forefront of this work. So I'll highlight just a few examples. One co-designed research program is on Indigenous waters and is really emphasizing community priorities for the component that's done in partnership with 10 different tribes around the what is now the California area. This work involves things like tribally led research and education projects on hydrology and ecosystem impacts, from the surveying of springs to the technical assessment of water quality and hydrology, to even creating curriculum for high school through college level. It also involves research partnerships with tribal higher education institutions. Now, really, in order to do this work as geoscientists at a historically white higher education institution like UCLA, this has also involved our learning about tribal histories and protocols, working with our American Indian Studies Center, and really diving into the literature on this. It means that we're holding listening sessions with our tribal partners and spending time really building relationships to support being able to work with them. It also involves creating a tribal board to steer the work that we do. And then within our own institution, it involves research with Indigenous and other BIPOC students and postdocs and faculty on a number of different areas, from some of the surface hydrology work I was just talking about using geochemistry and sedimentary geology and climate models, to Indigenous archaeology, to ethnography to look at cultural narratives on environmental change, on how environmental change affects water. Now, another project we're supporting, we're collaborating to support research with tribal stewards and practitioners around land and coastal stewardship. And this includes supporting tribal stewards training, their own training from their own partners in ethnobotany, cultural resource management, but also training that we bring on things like geochemistry, environmental DNA. We're studying past, present, and future marine biodiversity and paleo environments, and really looking at localized conservation and climate mitigation efforts, including kelp, seagrass, and wetlands restoration. Some of our work will be brought into a youth leaders program where older youth and young adults who have some knowledge of Western STEM concepts will be sharing their traditional language as well as Western STEM concepts with younger generations. And then finally, as a third example, we've been working with a center that I'm part of to build out a Navajo Science Scholars Network. This is really based on initial relationship building several years ago with listening sessions, reciprocal visits, and has led to field work and research experience and mentorship. This year, in response to a lot of the COVID-19 engagement and basic needs that we heard about, we decided to work with our partners to launch a workshop series, and we've had over 50 Navajo participants, where there's opportunities to hear from scholars about their personal and academic journeys, their relationships with education and how they've reclaimed narratives, and also understanding how Indigenous knowledge systems can function in science and in scientific settings, including in communities. So for the very last part of today's talk, I want to highlight how so much of this work really is done as part of the Center for Diverse Leadership in Science, from the research that I showed you in the geosciences to work with our partners. Now, part of the motivation really came from looking at diversity data from Rachel Bernard and Emily Cooperdock that they published, shown in the upper left. At the undergraduate level, there's been an increase in diversity in the geosciences, as in other STEM disciplines. But what we see is that most of the advances have been made at minority serving institutions and not in historically white institutions and primarily white institutions. What we also see is that the retention rates at a national and local level tend to be 20 to 40% of people from traditionally marginalized groups. And at the PhD level, what we see is that there's been almost no change in diversity amongst Earth, atmospheric, and oceanic sciences, described in this paper. So this really shows why it's critical to have engagement at all levels. And so we've really thought of ourselves as working within an ecological framework, like what's shown in the lower left, where really at the individual level, it takes a commitment to change. It takes having changes in practices at department and institutional levels, but also it takes having policies and societal attitudes shifting. And so one of the things we're seeing now is that certainly societal attitudes are shifting, but our higher education policies and departmental practices changing. Certainly at the individual level, there have been calls to change, as I'll show you. So I think, those of us who are in positions of power within higher education institutions really have a mandate to follow kind of what's happening from top down and bottom up in terms of the calls for action. Well, there are data that show us what the path forward is. For example, with our own work, we have 70% geo-environmental retention rates and 90% in STEM. And I just show you the demographics of the folks we've been working with here in the lower right. And so this is really critical for thinking about how we actually can move towards justice. And this is just from an event we're holding next month. So with respect to the center, we have a whole series of goals that I show here. We implement several interventions that were found to be critical for effective diversification of the life sciences by Silvia Hurtado in a 2017 paper, who is a member of the National Academy of Education. And so that's what this figure here comes from. And we have worked on incorporating elements of all of these things within the center. Now, our center has a multi-tiered fellowship program. We have cohorts with social belonging at several levels, including at the early career level and at the faculty level. We, of course, have leadership skills trainings, but we also ensure that those trainings are put into practice so that we start to see change being made. And we focus on using principles of equity for distributing resources. Now, just to show you that equity does not mean that we lose in quality, whatever that means in any way. In fact, if we use a number of metrics to look at the development of science identity, science understanding, technical skills, and higher skills, we see that in fact there's substantial gains from the model that we've used based on a pilot that was done in my own lab in 2017. And these responses are from about over 50 people. So our program really started with myself showing up in a department and wondering how was it that although we had students that look like me. I was the only person there at the faculty level who did. And so I brought my own lived experience and reflections on what was really important for my own retention and dove into the literature to really understand and contextualize those experiences further. And then decided to set out first on implementing that's really focused on inclusion and justice, elevate diversity and inclusion for climate research. And I also just want to highlight, that we really kind of think about power and the way we collaborate given different levels of privilege within the setting. And this was something that was written about and reflected on by an undergraduate fellow of our center who was a sociology major. So in our case, we have leadership teams at the early career and faculty staff level. We're very much led by people of color, and we are really active in discussions about how we can achieve a critical mass for national change with a consortium for diverse leadership in science. Now, the center also responded to the events of last summer with George Floyd and Breonna Taylor's murders in several ways. And part of that included thinking about the spaces we were in with an anti-racism letters analysis. So we've looked so far, we have 60 letters from higher education spaces, mainly STEM spaces from across the country. These are letters from students, staff, and faculty calling for change from their institutions. And so we were curious about what were the commonalities in what the asks were. And so this shows the results from about half of them. This is still work in progress. And there are some very common things that people are asking for, including institutional advocacy work for Black scholars, for Indigenous scholars, for other people of color, having public stances around anti-racism and public engagement, showing evidence for change by changing policies, diversifying faculty, supporting fellowships for students, and so forth. Now, there are other calls for action that have been written by things like professional societies and groups of community members, including what's shown here, which was a petition with over 30,000 signatures, and then a letter that I and 9 other BIPOC geoscience colleagues wrote that's now been endorsed by professional societies that represent over 60,000 of us. And in all of these cases, there are actionable strategies that are the roadmap for change. And so I want to highlight that in what we wrote, we called for action within universities that were in meaningful ways, including committing to hiring, promoting, supporting, and retaining faculty of color, making sure that ethical anti-racist policies were in fact being in place for hiring, admissions, and promotion, because what we see is that so often these policies maintain the status quo. Providing equitable access to mentoring and inclusive administrative practices so that campus leadership knows really how to steer change and can amplify voices from below and from above. Requiring inclusive and equitable classroom practices. Having kind of a having 20 to 40% retention rates for different groups, be they first gen, low income, or BIPOC peoples. That type of having a 60 to 80% loss rate wouldn't be deemed acceptable in most other sectors of society. And then, there are roadmaps for effective practices from the educational literature and also from practices that have been put into place at minority serving institutions. We also been organizing workshops where we bring together people who are active as change agents and people who are curious about change, administrators, faculty and future faculty at our professional society meetings. And so we've been doing some on exploring challenges to diversifying faculty and strategies for navigating administrative barriers to thinking about strategies for student organizing. And I strongly recommend if you are, if Rutgers hasn't had a chance to do this, that you bring in a faculty member from the University of Rhode Island, from URI, Kendall Moore, who's created a series of films about what allyship and decolonizing practices look like in STEM, And she runs a series of trainings and has done this for, whole schools in the past. So with that, I just want to summarize that we've talked about some frontiers in isotope geochemistry that really sit grounded in physical chemistry, but have all sorts of applications, from thinking about carbon sequestration to biomineralization to even thinking about climate and Earth systems history. I've also talked about how doing this work really sits deeply in an inclusive science model where people are at the heart of it. And that includes work in the higher education space with the Center for Broadening Participation that I described, but also emphasizes healthy relationships between higher education and the communities that we're part of, including the Indigenous communities whose lens that we're on. And so with that, I'll say thank you and take questions.
Thank you very much. Beautiful science and beautiful work all across. I have a bunch of questions, but this is a student event, so I will stay quiet. Students, where are you?
Yeah, maybe you start us off so that you get the ball rolling.
It seems unfair. So I was really very impressed and enjoyed it very much. And towards the later part of the paleo thermometry part, yes, you brought up the cycling and the mass transport, which seem to be of crucial importance. I can imagine the kinetic limit where the transport is much faster than the change of interest. That's simple. Or the opposite limit, which is also simple. But when they occur on a similar timescale, that seems where the pandemonium may happen.
Yeah, that's such a beautiful, it's a beautiful commentary that sees right to the heart of really some of the kind of cutting edge with respect to building out a kinetic model that can explain what we see over a range of growth rates. So there's actually a really beautiful study by Don DePaulo, who is a member of National Academy and led the Lawrence Berkeley Labs, where he's really been kind of trying to explore this in a series of isotope systems, from calcium isotopes to oxygen isotopes to strontium calcium. And his model is very much kind of is a model that looks at kind of surface kinetics. There's also a model from Bruce Watson at RPI that has also dived a little bit into this. And so there's some that really look at solution equilibria, some that say surface kinetics are also an important model. But in all cases, in a relatively simple system, right, you're at a point where you have an equilibrium limit that's attained when growth rates are very slow. And so that would be the mineral equilibrium, let's say. And then in a system where the only factor might be DIC speciation and what we're seeing is that, the DIC pool is at equilibrium, it's had sufficient time at whatever pH it is, then we will attain a kinetic limit that reflects the composition of that DIC pool. So it's pH dependent with some mineral fractionation then introduced. But then and that's at very high growth rates that you attain that kinetic limit. But then at intermediate rates, what you likely have is this kind of smearing out, right, over that range. And so what's interesting is because the definition of clumped isotopes with a stochastic distribution is a complicated space, it's not, mixing is not linear in that space as well. And so you can start to get some really unusual potential artifacts in that space if you move away from just that kind of 2N member system. And, let's say you have CO2 hydroxylation and mixing with an equilibrated DIC pool, that's giving you some nonlinearities. So the theory isn't there yet. I think that is something that I'm fascinated by, and I think there's room to advance that further. But your question was very much right at where I think the frontiers of our mechanistic understanding and our ability to explain that from theory is. We have been doing some experiments at variable growth rate and with an enzyme present to catalyze DIC pool achieving equilibrium and to minimize then some of the solution equilibria effects. And so right now, that work is phenomenological. The theory hasn't caught up to that either.
Understood. Understood. Thank you. So this was the warm-up question. Now the really tough questions from the students.
Oh, wonderful questions coming up. Okay, so one question was, what, if any, were challenges to founding the center? And then in your experience, what strategies have helped to recruit students of color into the field? So a challenge to founding the center is that, so I am part of 3 different departments that touch on climate, environment, the earth. I'm still the only US-born person of color faculty. Most of my 2 of my departments, I'm still the only dark-skinned faculty member, the only woman of color. And so I think people's kind of awareness to how these different issues manifest themselves, we draw so much on our lived experience, of course, and what, unless we kind of dive really deeply in the literature and we really train ourselves to exercise this muscle of understanding and so forth. I think about it like if I wanted to run a marathon, I couldn't just go and run a marathon. Well, it's simply similar to that in terms of understanding issues relating to equity and justice and how injustices, how they manifest in this space for students, for staff, for researchers, for faculty. You really have to train yourself if you haven't had experience, and it takes substantial effort to do so because we're in environments where we've normalized without even realizing it. We're trained up from an early time to normalize actually these spaces being predominantly white, which is what they are in STEM. To me, it was shocking when I read this paper from 2018 about how there had been no progress with the number of PhDs who are Black, who are Indigenous, who are Latinx in my fields, that there might only be 1 or 2 students in a PhD program in the whole country who graduate, right? And that was that to me opened my eyes about how much work we really have to do. And so if we don't all see that and acknowledge that that we've normalized this for historical reasons, and that we have to really actively work to be sensitized to this, and that we need to appreciate there are people who they may be in critical race theory, or they may be some of the folks who did, like me, succeed through enormous networks of support, then it will, then we're just going to keep reproducing the same processes. The history of this country was apartheid, right? Like in South Africa. But that was the US up until the Civil Rights Act. And then there was enormous pushback. And then we really never grappled with that in STEM and higher education about that legacy in a very effective way. So the challenges to founding the center, are to be as a faculty member pushing for change, students seeing these being issues, faculty in other spaces seeing these as issues, but having many faculty who don't understand the harm that this does. And so what that means is that I've found critical mass through creating the center as a structure that cuts across departments. So if any department you have a couple of people, you start to get critical mass if you do something across the division or across a school or across the university. Another challenge is really then finding support, because DEI work is this type of work to open space up and to try to heal our institutions so they can truly achieve the full potential that they represent for everyone. That is something that takes resources. An undergraduate may have a choice between a job that puts food on the table or putting their time into this. And the same is true actually also for staff and even for faculty, although to different levels, right? Because our salaries are quite different. But recognizing that, then it's how do you actually value and support people doing this work? So our model is that this work is for everyone. Anyone can become a member. Anyone can apply to become a fellow. And in fact, we have fellows who are from dominant groups and who may be from more affluent backgrounds, but we will use an equity lens for distributing our resources. And what that means is that, in the case of our fellows, all of our fellows get a base stipend. They're undergraduates, it's a smaller amount. If they're graduate students or postdocs, it's a larger amount. but then we work with them and with the financial aid office to see if they, are working jobs to get by outside of the university, or if they have loans instead of grants or fellowships, can we actually then use some of our resources to give them more funding? But as a state university, we've had a number of challenges funding wise, and because we're grassroots and didn't start from the administration fully as top down, that means that a lot of our, all of our funding right now is funding that I raise, right? And we've supported 140 early career fellows and 24 faculty fellows. Those 140 early career fellows are from across the country, and we're a multi-year program. It's a lot of money. It's kind of over $1 million a year for the size of our program. And to do all of that on grants means that a challenge to founding it is that, I have a professor hat, a center director hat, but then also a development officer hat that I wear. And that's just another example then of how DEI is not truly kind of valued, in that it's not truly supported in the way that, other things would be supported. So I like to say we're kind of ahead of our time, but we're, constantly speaking to different administrative offices and funders to say, this is one of the many ways that, there's room for growth, basically. The strategies for helping to recruit students of color into the field, it's so important to actually focus on retention. So if you focus on retention and you have a healthy environment, recruitment is not an issue. So I think that retention, the things that support this are really focusing on supporting faculty to develop inclusive classrooms, supporting faculty to develop evidence-based strategies to support active learning from, science and math to geology classes, all of these classes, to develop learning communities for students, and to incentivize and support students' participation in these things, given that they don't all face the same challenges, in terms of if you're working jobs to support yourself or support family, you need to have additional resources to be able to fully take advantage of resources the university offers. I think it's extremely powerful that our program is multi-generational. So that means we're high school through postdoctoral through faculty level. So most programs are single staged, but because of our specific structure, that means that an undergraduate who's a freshman gets to interact with a PhD student or a postdoc, as well as faculty, who they have some commonality of lived experience or aspects of identity. And that kind of approach suddenly means that, you can see something and then suddenly you model that trajectory that you might not have otherwise, had thought was accessible. And the power of really having, particularly BIPOC people as faculty, as postdocs, as senior graduate students, at all of those levels, really makes a dramatic difference. And there are ways to do this, in that several universities have mentor professor programs, future faculty programs, where, these are kind of a step up from a postdoc where you're, teaching a class, getting faculty mentorship as a way, and, with the specifics that you'll then be considered at the end of this program for recruitment into a faculty line. There's a lot of cluster hiring that's going on that's been really, really effective as well. And so, that strategy of having people kind of in leadership just ends up being very powerful. Also because many of us navigated so many challenges. And so I think that there's also another aspect of recruiting students of color into the field that's relevant to institutions like Rutgers and UCLA. I found it extremely helpful to develop very healthy, mutually beneficial relationships with minority serving institutions as partners. I went to one myself, to Cal State LA, a Hispanic serving institution. I've been very intentional about keeping relationships with faculty and recruiting through there, but then also for tribal institutions and historically Black colleges and universities doing this as well, recognizing that the faculty and students there have invaluable perspectives that we need, right? Just as much as they would benefit from saying having access to faculty and institutions like Rutgers with extraordinary infrastructure and a breadth of faculty expertise that is not often seen at many minority serving institutions at this stage. And so I think that kind of relationship where you acknowledge strengths, all around, and then you ask, how could we build a collaborative relationship that would be healthy for students and faculty at your institutions to support pathways, where faculty actually engage in reciprocal visits and really kind of listen and recognize that it may take our faculty writing some of the staff writing some of the grants and maybe co-teaching classes and doing joint seminars, that those are things where we don't then see that there's one institution with a deficit, or we reinforce kind of colonial attitudes that unfortunately are that are deep-seated. And it manifested itself even with me, with a partnership with one institution where they're like, hey, we can provide you with a letter of support for this proposal, but we didn't really have time to build this proposal out together. So, what are your thoughts on that? And I'm like, you know what? We will wait on this deadline. It will come up next year, and let's spend the next year building a better relationship so I can get your input and really listen. And I said, I'm sorry I came to you so late in terms of asking for a letter for this grant. And then in doing so, we've now had 3 students from this HBCU come here. We're collaborating with our faculty. It's just a much healthier relationship as a result. There is another question here about starting an academic career at such a young age. What led me to become interested in this domain of research at such an age of 12? Well, it's a bit of a sad story that's shared, unfortunately, with all too many young people who are Black, Brown, and Indigenous in this country. I had parents who immigrated here and had a parent who was incarcerated when I was very young. So with my father going to prison when I was very young, that was obviously a very traumatic experience, right? I mentioned at the beginning of the talk what it means to lose a parent. I lost him in a different way. And that certainly had a whole series of scars that ran itself through all of our lives. And for my mom, she came from a village in Fiji where she was the first generation to get the equivalent of a high school degree. She grew up there when it was still a colony and when she didn't have the same rights as others. But she said to us that it was her nursing school education that meant that she could support us when times got really tough, given what was happening with my father. And so she said, my education was something that meant I could put food on the table for you and your sister. She said, your education is something that, people can take away family and sorts of things, but they can't take that away from you. And so with that, I spent a lot of time reading and in libraries as free childcare, basically, when growing up. And so like a lot of kids, when you engage with what infrastructure is there for you. So if where you find community is with kids in libraries, then that's where your passion is. And if where you find infrastructure is with kids in other groups, then that's where your passion is. And so for me, I went to college thinking that what I wanted to do was to either help my father by becoming a judge, a Supreme Court judge as a young kid. That's what I thought. Or when I started taking criminal justice and poli-sci classes, I realized that wasn't so much for me. So then I tried some of the pre-med classes and wasn't really passionate about dissecting things. But, maybe as a sophomore, I took an environmental geology and society class. And I think that the opportunity to, be immersed in nature, to be part of a really diverse peer group who are also taking some of these classes, that, it let me see that there were ways to be social in what I was learning with other people who kind of had their own sets of odd histories that, each of us would feel isolated by that, but collectively in the field together, we could kind of remove a lot of those social trappings and just engage as people. And I also loved that with a bit of scientific literacy, to know that you could do things like engage in environmental planning and in ways that could save lives through, environmental infrastructure. And so that was kind of one of the things that really helped me get interested in this domain of research. When I took a class, when I started taking more classes in that area, I saw that even like concepts from math to chemistry to physics to engineering suddenly became far more interesting than they had in that kind of earlier context. And it's one of the things that makes me appreciate that inclusive teaching methods in some of our fundamental areas really are ones where we take a problems-based approach, right? And we really can try to see, here's how physical chemistry is directly connected to our day-to-day lives. And that just can open doors. So thank you for that question.
We so appreciate your talk and your answers to these really important questions and the ideas that you have to kind of bring a more inclusive STEM experience to Rutgers. So thank you so much. This has been really terrific. And we hope that we could find further collaborations with you and your group in the near future.
Thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure. Take care, everybody.
Absolutely a pleasure.
Bye.